As Paul referenced, again, my name is Roberto Aponte, and I could share more about who I am offline, and I'll share my contact information. But for today, as Paul mentioned, one of the volunteers in the event planning committee. And as we were moving through discussions in the planning and putting together this great content and all the speakers and panels and all of it was coming together, we were noticing, you know what, we need to balance at least a little bit, all of this rich, logical, kind of left brain conversation that we're going to be having with some arts and some creativity. And so how can we do that was the question. And the person I'm going to introduce you to is kind of the perfect person we think to lead us through something that will get us into our other part of our body and our full humanness. I have the pleasure and honor of introducing Hakim Bellamy. Hakim is the first poet laureate of Albuquerque. He's also received numerous national and regional honors for his poetry. And I've come across Hakim's work on several occasions, but two that stand out for me is once I've seen Hakim work with high school students here in Santa Fe, helping them connect and tap into their own creativity and their own poetic abilities while exploring the challenges of their lives. And then recently, Hakim lent his skills to supporting policy and advocacy work around environmental issues here in New Mexico. And as I alluded to, what he's going to share with you today is not just a break and a reprieve from all of the kind of rich content. And so I guess what I'm trying to say, it's not just an infusion of the arts, but you'll see with what he's going to share with us, how the arts can actually support the work that we're trying to do with these conversations around finance and social entrepreneurship. So with that, I would like to welcome Hakim Bellamy.
Thank you so much, Roberto. And it's a joy to be with you all today. I was connecting all the dots when Roberto first started telling me about the symposium. I was like, I feel like I was at something like that last year, and I indeed was. And so I was like, I actually saw a picture of a friend of mine, Danica Padilla from Mia Wolf, and I was like, yeah, I was there, and the mayor was there too. I wasn't part of his security detail. I just was interested, and I was like, man, it would be great to figure out how not that's how we do better business and good business and corporate responsibility, but how we actually like reimagine what it means to what prosperity means, how we actually reimagine a system that's not winners and losers, right? And so I like Roberto said, and thank you, Roberto, comrade. It's been great to be in this work with you for so long in so many different ways. Definitely as fathers too, through our fathering practices, because and for those of you who are fathers or have had to put up with one, it is a practice. It's never perfect, so it's always a practice. But that just to be here with you today and to share, like Roberto said, hopefully something that actually aligns, and it's not just that ginger when you have your sushi. It's not just a palate cleanser. It's actually adding to the meal. And so I'm going to jump in because typical Hakim fashion, stacked myself right up to my time allotment, and I think I begin by sharing my screen. So let me do that first. Get to the right part so y'all don't see my messy desktop. I hit screen share. All right, and I think here we are. And in a perfect world, every time I hit the space bar, it'll do that. Okay, so for people for profit, I just invented my own hashtag, and that was in the early parts of trying to figure out what I was going to title this thing. But I think it still fits. And so I'm thankful to the team there at Believe Symposium to when they were asking me, like, do you want to change the title? And I was like, no, title still fits. I tried to be cheeky in a poetic way because, like people before profit. So there's lots of fours and people and profit in there, but nonetheless, we'll keep it moving. This is me. I'm Hakim Bellamy. I am most recognized in this community as the first poet laureate, but I currently am the deputy director for the Department of Arts and Culture. For those of you who knew that my department is Cultural Services, that name is gone. On Mardi Gras, we became the Department of Arts and Culture. We feel like it better fits what we do. And that's just a screenshot of my own website, because as an independent contractor, as Beyond Poetry LLC, which is my business, I am the evil corporation that I often write about in my work. So poetry is sometimes referred to as an economy of language, right? And so that usually doesn't mean like poetry, like fantastic poetry about the laws of economics and Adam Smith and good things like that. It usually means, right, that you should be able to say what you say in shorter bursts of words, Hakim. You should not overtalk it. When you overtalk it, it's just talking. But when you actually distill it to fewer words for greater impact, it actually becomes poetry. And I found that amusing and wanted to start out sharing that with y'all, because if brevity and the actual economics of economy were a thing, and it was about less is more, then we're doing it terribly wrong, right? And so we're doing it all wrong. And so I was like, so what would I call this field, right? Would I call it, the poetry of economics? Or is it poetry economics? Like, does it actually get a name? And would anyone, even the folks in this room who I imagine are economic nerds like me, would they actually show up for double doses of boring college classes like poetry and like economics? And then I was like, maybe we call it Pokenomics. And since I was born in Philly and the Poconos are nearby, I was like, that might feel like trademark infringement, and I could probably get sued. But I couldn't resist putting Edgar Allan Poe's name in the term economics. I think it's just Reaganomics, but way cooler. And then I was like, Ponomics, right? Because now we're really getting to the economic of language, where brevity, short, and shorter. And then I was like, even has a little bit of an Obamics, Ebonics. We try to do away with the vowels, try to buy a vowel in that Wheel of Fortune way. And then I was like, Freakonomics. That's interesting, and that is actually a word. And I actually wrote a poem based on that book, right? And so, but I will spare you guys that. But I will say, I will share a little excerpt with you, because I want to kind of show you my progression and how sort of terrified I was when Roberto first approached me. But I was like, but I believe in the work that's happening at this conference, and the idea that business and profit is not necessarily the enemy, that we can come to some homeostasis where where we do good economically and spiritually and socially. Like we could arrive at that. And I generally feel that was the major intentions for all the early corporations and economies, including the corporation and economy that is the United States of America. But I didn't know that I don't have the background. I am not, by no means. I was a chemical engineering major for a little bit, and then finished with a BS in biology and got a master's in communications, and was like, none of that speaks to me being smarter about economics than anyone in this room. But I was like, but I've been writing about it for so long. And this particular poem was not the first poem I wrote about the idea of corporate responsibility, the idea of profit for good, the idea of people before profit. I actually, one of the first poems I wrote about it was actually a poem called Citizens United, obviously, about the infusion of corporate capital into our electoral system. And it was in my book that I published with UNM Press in 2012. And so as I went back, I was like, dude, you're like a little scared that you don't know anything about this, and you've kind of obsessed over it for over 9 years now. And so this particular poem was written for the New Mexico Health Equity Working Group for Anti-Racism Day at the New Mexico State Legislature. Shout out to all of the survivors of the session. But I was there in the roundhouse reading this poem to hopefully, ideally, influence any passerby lawmakers, but mainly because in New Mexico, if you've been up there, there's programming in the rotunda. And so we had some programming. We gave away some awards to some young people who won the scholarship contest. And I wrote this poem. And I'm not going to read you the whole poem, because I actually, at the end of this presentation, I have a poem I wrote just for you today. But I was like, I really want to some of the themes, like how unoriginal I've been and have said the same thing over and over again, frankly found fascinating. So here's an excerpt from Freakonomics 2015. The business of documenting injustice is a game of numbers, a false binary of ones and zeros rather than a quantum of personhood. People who count and people who don't, like votes, this business of documenting injustice is an equation stripped of its stripes, demoted from equal to minus, like a repeating decimal, like a repeating decimal, like a repeating decimal, an irrational number where a small fraction of people own a large fraction of the wealth, a repeating decimation, repeating decimation, repeating decimation, an irrational number where a small fraction of people own our fracture of wealth, a one over everything else, over 100, over everyone, until it looks like an I. And so that's just like, I'm like, let me say how when you hear the last poem, you're gonna be like, man, he definitely has been meditating on this particular topic for a long time. I even look back and was like, some of the very same lines and metaphors, which, it's probably not helping me come off as really original, but that's obviously where my heart is. And so I wanted to also share that other artists, like other poets, over generations have written poems, right, about these issues that you all are talking about today, and trading perspectives on today. And one of the oldest, and I'm not going to say it's the first, I didn't go back that far, it was a little bit of research I did, but one of the oldest ones I found was this poet, Stephen Crane. And he writes this poem, The Impact of a Dollar Upon the Heart. And it's really the second stanza there where you start to really see him, as we would say where I'm from in Philadelphia, get busy, and he talks about the impact of $1 million as a crash of flunkies and yawning emblems of Persia, cheeked against oak, France, and a saber, the outcry of old beauty, whored by pimping merchants. I think we'll leave him there for right now. But obviously, it shows you a little bit of his framework and heart about the issue, in stark contrast to what he wrote in the opening paragraph, like the impact of a dollar versus the impact of $1 million. And I was like, that's a cool contrast. That's a cool framework. That the poetry educator in me was like, man, that's an interesting framework for a poem. And then we move forward a couple hundred years to a former United States poet laureate, W.S. Merwin. And in his 1967 book, The Lice, he takes another approach, right, to talking about the politics and the poetics, if you will, of money, right, the poetics of economics, the poetics of prosperity. And he is really looking at it from that activist lens that, if you're a poetry lover like me, there's ways to write at the system, there's ways to write about a system, and then there's ways to be the real advocate, and he was definitely a nature advocate. So to talk about the casualties of the system, right? And so for those of us who've been doing this work for a while, and we're talking about not necessarily corporate greed or wealth, we're actually talking about the byproducts of corporate growth, and really what that does to our environment, what that does to our animals, what that does to our air and our water. And that's where W.S. Merwin was coming from, right? And so he comes at it like with this gray whale metaphor, right? Gray whale, now that we are sending you to the end, that great God, tell him that we who follow you invented forgiveness and forgive nothing. So he comes at it real powerful. It's probably why he was elected poet laureate in the United States. But and then it goes on, right, to kind of do the things that poets do, which is to make you feel it instead of intellectualize it. But I thought that was a great example of like, how do we write about, rampant corporate growth? Some would call it even greed, but how do we write about it from a space of not just the power in the system, but essentially the victims, especially the victims who can't speak and write poems for themselves, right? So that's where W.S. Merwin is coming from. And then Alison Cobb, more recently as 2014, I just thought that her poem was fantastically lyrical and literal. And she kind of really frames it in an interaction, like what would be a dinner party interaction, or any interaction that we would have if we were all together in person, and we'd have our little break and there'd be a water cooler and some cut fresh fruit, the kind of things that kind of happen when you're milling about and mingling and doing the businessy thing. And Allison's poem, in my opinion, is phenomenal. And she goes, the business hands I shook hand with, drinking local whiskey at a party Christmas winter, I mean non-religious, for the green group where his wife donates her hours just bought an old Victorian cheaper than a Craftsman, and one of Portland's oldest best said, cost the cost of doing business, one cost of doing business, all of life of costs, a cost the businessman made, exercise machines in China for the bodies of Americans to sweat upon, the muscles, heart, and blood vessels, the lungs, he said, they never even counted labor, costs the labor, lives so cheap, it was the metal minerals, the plastic parts, they had to calculate the labor, lives so cheap, they didn't even count. And I just thought that that was cool. She was scatting for my beat poets and the jazz poets in the room. It was more musical than meaning or semantics, but they were like these images that you could see of flashing of kind of all the accoutrements that we normally have of normal corporate society. And when she does that, she doesn't have to make a statement on it, really. I mean, she's making her politics are in what images do I choose to show or not show. But really, she's just giving you the images and allowing you to connect the dots and form your own constellation. And so I show you those before I share a few more of mine and then get to the poem that I really wrote for you and brought for you today. By putting a mirror up to it and saying, you know, we're not all in this room just because we're like big bad corporations. We're like, actually, there's a way to tame this beast and make it do what I would say it's intended to do before, you know, it became more like us and less like the inception and the idea of itself, kind of like democracy. And there's this guy, right? His name's Micah Maddox. And I don't know if you read the American Spectator. I don't, because if you know my politics, I'm a little left of center and this guy's a little right of center. But he has a great article, and I'm a little bit of sadomasochist of like, I really like to hear the bad things people want to say about me. And he has this article called Poets and Capitalism that he wrote in 2012. And I think it's worth sharing because obviously Micah's a smart person. Like, you know, poets don't get to own the banner of being smart. And he's smart in ways that I'm not, right, as a journalist and in other ideas of politics and economics. But he wrote this essay that was like lots of shade towards people like me, but I was like, huh, that's pretty good literary analysis too. And he says, right, in the matter of capital, poetry and crisis in the American century, Harvard 2011, Christopher Nealon explains that many 20th century poets, particularly American, have spoken out against capitalism because of their fear that capitalism causes cultural homogeneity and political and economic turmoil. He's got me right so far. No doubt many poets believe that capitalism leads to both homogeneity and instability, and the best among them subtly critique the consumerism and excess that one finds in all affluent societies, America in particular. Right on the nose, Micah. Wendell Berry's agrarianism and Philip Levine's portraits of the working class suggest that we have lost something of the relational aspect of work. This critique of capitalism or the excesses of industrialization is worth hearing, whether or not one agrees that capitalism itself is to blame. It is constructive, free of shrill, and generous. Here's the turn, the contrapunta, as we call it in haiku. But there are two further responses to capitalism in contemporary poetry that are less constructive and effective. One of those responses has been for poets to create poems that rail against hierarchy and morality in an effort to free their audience from the shackles of the great capitalistic machine. A second response for poets is to no longer write for the general audience, but for their own fellow poets and kindred spirits alone. We call that preaching to the choir. Paul Goodman was the first to suggest that this is in his 1951 article, Advance-Garde Writing, the problem for the avant-garde writer represented in this work, which is rejected by his audience, the problem for the avant-garde writer, Goodman states, is that he has internalized societal conflict, there we go, and represented it in his work, which is rejected by his audience and sanctioned. The communal aspect of art has been broken, and what Goodman proposes is that poets stop writing for a general audience and reestablish a plausible audience of their peers. He's not wrong. Both of those approaches you heard in the poems I read about you by poets who are far more accomplished than me, some no longer with us and some still alive. And then he even goes on to throw shade on, because I think he wanted to single out the New York school of poets. So John Ashbery, Frank O'Hara, and Kenneth Koch to say like, they do all those things and they do all these things for the wrong reason. And so I wanted to frame that because I was like, you know, I'm positioning my work in a lineage of work, as you saw, with people who are older than me and have written longer than me. And we're all doing these things for better or for worse. And I also submit that this group today is not that choir. It's not that choir of preaching to necessarily, right? Especially not in as far as poetics is concerned. Maybe we all have similar leanings and values around our views of economy, of economics. But I was like, oh no, there's starting to be a merging of audiences here, Micah. And whether you like it or not, that is indeed happening at this particular symposium. And so now that I've like literally showed you all the tricks, this is like a magician's lecture, and now you're gonna see all the tricks in action, right? Show you how all the tricks work. But I want to finish the timeline of how often I obsess over these things that you all have asked me to come speak about today. So in 2015, some of you might be aware of a project that the city has actually stood involved with just as recently as today. Mayor Keller's administration released a press release about the city being engaged in the Living Cities Initiative. And out of the Living Cities Initiative, we actually started something here locally that is, I think, is beginning to run its life cycle, called City Alive. But I was a part of the early goings of City Alive, and in City Alive, which is not the, there we go. There we go. That's what I want to show you. In City Alive, I was asked early on to write a poem and share it at the Albuquerque Living Cities Integration Initiative Planning Year celebration. And it, and then we ended up actually naming our local entity City Alive. So I was humbled and honored by that recognition. But that poem kind of goes like this. And like I said, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you'll see some themes that continue to emerge. There's a city inside me where table linens and extra place settings constitute a meeting, where the open invitations have been sent and the table extenders are always met with open arms and extra chairs, where plain talk poetry is on the menu, where the boardroom is in the kitchen, where people, politics, profit, and promise all sit at the same dining room table, where everyone waits for everyone else to get served before they eat, right? Different approach, not talking directly to the system, more doing what Octavia Butler talks about is we as writers and artists are supposed to be creating future worlds. We shouldn't spend all our time railing at the system, but we should kind of put out a vision for what a better world would look like, right? And then there was in 2017, I was invited to the New Mexico Association of Grant Makers joint conference at the Hyatt Regency Tamaya. Some of you know that place. I used to bartend there. And in 2017, they asked me to come and share a poem about some of their work or connect it to their work. And I shared this, actually with a few quotes. It started, one of which was Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said, "It is one of the beautiful compensations of life that no man can sincerely help another without helping himself." And then I kind of jump into my work. For generations, we've been trying to fill the holes inside of us and in our society with money, to tender the chasm between the haves and the have-nots, to balance the injustice teetering on the backs of our history, to reach that ever so elusive number that will one day make everyone one. And then later in 2017, I was able to share a poem with the New Mexico Commission on Community Volunteerism. Some of y'all know that as AmeriCorps, or the National Commission on Community Service. And it was really about service, but service, volunteerism, thinking about someone besides yourself, some of the themes you all have been talking about today. I was able to share this kind of piece that was a metaphor for how the hand is about the size, as you can see there. The bald fist is about the size of one's art. And it goes, how do you measure a hand? Do you measure it in how many times we've helped someone up, push somebody down, or punch somebody in the face? How do you give someone a hand? What does it weigh? What kind of load does it lift? Can you measure it in newtons? Is charity just a willful suspension of gravity for guilt, for good, or for justice? But if what they say is true, the volume of a hand balled up in desperation is approximately the size of a fist. Perhaps we are fighting for something different. Perhaps we are fighting different. Perhaps we are fighting for love with love, catching all these hands in a circle together like answered prayers. Perhaps the measure of a hand is a heart. And you know what they say about people with big hearts? They are born to serve. And so you will see some of those metaphors in this poem I leave you with. I read it for you guys. Home economics, AKA home ec, AKA Mitt Romney was wrong. And I'll make that my outro because Mitt's been getting beat up by the left and the right lately. So I felt like everybody could agree that Mitt Romney is wrong, whether you were like, corporations are people, or you're just like, how could you ever impeach the president? But this is the poem. This is the poem here. And thank you all for your time today. He said, corporations are people too. And he was not kidding. Humorously, nor technically, legally, nor practically. A corporation is a person made up by a group of people. And then imagine trying to convince a classroom full of teenagers in heat that this idea of a person made by a gang of people in an otherwise bored room is anything but an orgy at best. Whatever happened to home ec? Some might call it the business, but incorporation is not how babies are made. What about the birds and the bees? What if global warming is nothing but the globe warning us about another big freeze? Ice Age 2 a brew right here at the center of our anatomy and physiology. What happened? When did the perpetual pursuit of profit turn our souls into amputees? How did it turn our hearts so cold? Then green, then Grinches. When did we stop making meteorology our business? Whether too much sun means famine, whether too much rain means flood, whether too much is too much, and whether enough is enough. When did we stop teaching each other to listen to the weather in our veins? If you listen close enough, you can hear nuclear winter coming. But when the science points towards people instead of money, all of a sudden we don't believe in it anymore. Staring at the cold, hard nanotechnology in our palms that feeds us stories about how all the nanoscientists got it all wrong. How are people so obsessed with wealth, so bad at math? All about carrying the one and throwing the remainders in the trash. Never want to show our work or our workers. Steady counting on fingers underneath tables instead of fair wages until unpaid labor is forced to erect an above ground railroad and barely enough fingers left to make a fist. Where family leave equals a handful of kids, where the opposite of addition isn't extraction, where profit is not pie and eat it too. Where profit is so much more than total revenue minus the cost, when there is nothing greater than the cost of doing nothing, when the cost of business as usual is a total loss, and loss is very, very expensive. In fact, it's priceless. When did making a living off of a degree in English become a joke? When did the definition of wealthy become majoring in business is your only hope? When did the words become so cheap? While the magnitude of tuition increased by at least an order of three? When did language become currency? And if so, wouldn't the richest country in the world be the one where the most people read? When we finally put our money where our mouth is, will that be the day that we realize that we can't eat money? Will wealth go back to meaning worth? Will fortune go back to meaning future? Will the definition of business cease to be winners and losers? The day we lose interest in interest and our impact is too fat to fit in our pockets because entrepreneurship has already always been social, long before we made them transactional. Relationships were a commodity, a trade-off of mutual funds and best interests. When will we revisit our charters? Re-envisioned by artists, revised by authors in a world where public good is great and public benefit is not for martyrs. There is no such thing as micro, only macroeconomics, where profit is interconnected, not Newtonian, where a dollar earned by one doesn't have to be at the expense of another, where our grandchildren are our whole entire world, and we don't want to leave our planet left holding the bag. An inheritance of emptiness, a miscarriage of character, where shareholder actually means share and company culture is the bottom line, where you can't take it with you is more than just an insensitive thing rich people say to other rich people instead of who's going to clean this mess we've left behind. We are plenty financially literate in this country, fluent in scorched earth capitalism and personal debt. Instead, let's beef up on courses in the humanities, come up with a theory of prosperity that's a bit more relative. If we've learned nothing from Wolf of Wall Street, it's that the difference between predator and prey is not some industrial evolution. It's a revolution of the heart, an innately human superpower seen by some as a mortal flaw. And as we've tried over the ages to reverse engineer it out of our offspring, some by lab class and others by lab coat, we are reminded in short that Mitt Romney was wrong. Corporations are not people, they are zombies. Frankensteins of our own doing, false gods gestated in our own image, a couple hundred pages of paperwork and ink, no pigment, a manifestation of our most primal instincts, a flipped coin wish, heads or tails, between our worst nightmares and our wildest dreams, our very own little monsters, but they don't have to be. Thank you.